Hello, friends. So far, we have been reading lots of historical fiction books. We started this historical fiction unit earlier this week, so I just want to review the lessons that we've done together. So, readers of historical fiction read analytically, studying parts that clue them into the facts, feelings, or setting. So, in our first lesson, we thought a lot about how the setting was affecting the story. Then, our second lesson was where we were thinking about how the pieces fit together. We were doing that by asking the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, how. Okay? Today we're going to move on to the third lesson, which is we're going to figure out the main character's timeline and the historical timeline. So we know that a historical fiction text is a fiction story with a real setting that focus on a very specific time period. Earlier this week, you guys read Rose Blanche, and so our lesson today will follow what we've been learning in Rose Blanche, and we're going to use Rose Blanche to apply this new strategy that we're learning today. Okay? So that brings us to our teaching point, which is readers notice how history and characters fit together by we're going to do this by learning more about the time period in which our story takes place. We're going to notice how the character's timeline intersects with the timeline of world events. And then we're going to think, how does my main character fit into the time period? So our academic vocabulary is time period and timeline. We know that a timeline helps us to see the order of events, of how something happens. So a timeline looks like this. It tells us what happened first, second, and so on. So it gives us the sequence of events. And time period would be a very specific time in history. So what we're trying to achieve this period is we're going to try to learn more about the time period that our stories take place by reading non-fiction texts and analyzing the images that we see. And this is going to help us make sense of the plot in our historical fiction reading in a deeper way. Okay, so I'm going to model how this works. So first, I'm going to go to just a regular, the beginning part of Rose Blanche, right here. And this is happening at the very beginning. I'm going to analyze what's happening in the text. I'm going to ask myself, how is this part of the text helping me to understand the time period that the story is taking place in? So we know that the story of Rose Blanche takes place during World War II. We know that this happened during Hitler's Nazi reign, and we see the Nazi symbol in these pictures here. Okay. And something interesting that we can learn from this picture is that we see Rose Blanche. She's kind of waving at the reader. She's like, hi, this must be a parent here with her. And if we take a closer look at Rose Blanche, at the very beginning, she's holding a Nazi flag. And she seems to be part of what's going on here with the soldiers. Doesn't seem like she's scared of them. And she fits in with everybody else. The soldiers are looking down at them. So the way that she's fitting into this specific time period, we know that she's not in any harm. So we learn that she's not a Jewish girl. She's not one of the children that would be taken. So she seems pretty comfortable. Later on in the text, after she has met the children in the concentration camp, and after she has started to help them, we find out in the last part of the book that she becomes a victim of war because she gets shot by the soldiers. Okay, and we know this because in the text it reads, shadows were moving between the trees. It was hard to see them. Soldiers saw the enemy everywhere. There was a shot. Okay, so now that we learned where she fits into history based on the text, we are going to take a look at an informational book, and we're going to try and ask ourselves, how does this main character fit into the time period? So remember that we're trying to match up our characters with the actual historical time period, and we're trying to see how the character's timeline intersects with the timeline of the world events. So guys, I'm in Epic right now, and I'm just going to type in the time period that my book takes place in. So it's World War II, and I'm going to hit enter. We get all these books. So now I'm interested in finding a book that will teach me about this time period and how my character fits into it. So this one says World War II through the eyes of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So I know he was the president of the US, so that's not going to be a good book for me. So I have all these other choices, like Women Pilots of World War II. Looks like a really cool book, but that's not really going to teach me about this time period. Causes of World War II, not really. Oh, but what about this one, World War II? Presents an overview of World War II. Also, it's going to tell me the main things that happened. This seems like a good book that can help me understand my character and the time period that this historical fiction story is taking place in. So I'm going to click on it, and it basically, I'm going to bring you back to the beginning. It gives us a table of contents, and it begins just giving us like an overview of the war. I'm interested in the end of the war because that was a really big part of Rose Blanche's story, and it's when she dies. So I'm going to go to that page. I'm just going to scroll down here to page 20. And I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to match it up with the book. Thanks to the entrance of the United States, the Allies were gaining momentum in Europe. In early 1944, the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion. Allied planes attacked German plane factories and oil refineries. The Allies shot down hundreds of defending Luftwaffe planes. This relentless attack all but wiped out the German Air Force threat. Allied planes destroyed railroads and bridges in northern France. This prevented the German army from moving easily. The Allies invaded France on June 6 of 1944. More than 5,000 ships and 11,000 planes crossed the English Channel overnight. At least 156,000 men and 50,000 vehicles had landed in Normandy, France by midnight on June 6th. Approximately 4,900 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing on the first day of the D-Day invasion. So from reading this part, we can tell that there were a lot of victims and a lot of people who died when the end of this war happened. So I can continue reading and you'll learn more. But I want to go to this part. So I'm going to read it. Jewish people, he also blamed them unfairly for Germany's loss in World War II. So this is talking about Hitler and how he blamed the Jewish people, and he blamed them for unfairly for losing World War I. The Nazis brought the prisoners to concentration camps such as Auschwitz in Poland. Prisoners were forced to do hard labor. They didn't get enough food. Many died of starvation and overwork. Those who were unable to work, including pregnant women, children, and elderly, and the sick, were killed in gas chambers. And I can recognize that this image right here is teaching me how happy these children are because finally they're getting liberated. And it reminds me of that image that we see in Rose Blanche of the children standing behind the barbed wire fence. The Nazis murdered at least 6 million people in the Holocaust. The Allies liberated the camps as they advanced through Germany. The atrocities they saw in the camps and the sickly conditions of the survivors shocked the world. Allied forces reached Berlin, Germany in April of 1945. Soviet Union soldiers found Hitler's remains in Berlin. He had killed himself. Germany officially surrendered on May 8. This date, now known as VE Day, for victory in Europe. And let's take a look at this over here, this another view, and it reads, imagine you lived in France during World War II. You know that the Nazis are rounding up Jews. You are not Jewish, but your neighbors are. You have a room in your house they could hide in. If they are discovered, the Nazis could kill your family and target others in your community. Would you risk your family's safety to protect your neighbors? So when I read this part, I immediately thought back to Rose Blanche because that's what she did. She risked her own life to help save the Jewish children in the concentration camp. She didn't save them, but at least she was helping by feeding them. So now I'm going back to our teaching point of how does my main character fit into this time period. And how does the information in the nonfiction book add or change to my character theory? So after reading that nonfiction book, I can see that Rose Blanche at the beginning, she was sympathizing with the Nazis. And then afterwards, after she learned what was really happening, she changed her mind and she tried helping. And she was a real rebel. She really went against what most people in her community believed, and she risked her own life. So she's a very brave person for doing that. So I want you guys to try this teaching point on your own now. I want you to find a part in the book that you're reading, and I want you to think, how does this part of the text helping me to understand the time period the story is taking place in? So go and find your book, pause the video, and try that. So readers, remember that we notice how history and characters fit together by learning more about the time period in which our story takes place. We notice how the character's timeline intersects with the timeline of world events. We think, how does my main character fit into the time period? So you're going to go on Epic or Mayan, and you're going to do the same thing that I taught you in this lesson. You're going to search for an informational text on the time period your story is taking place in. Then you're going to stop and jot. You're going to think, how is the text helping me to understand the time period? How does the character's timeline intersect with the timeline of world events? You're going to think, how does my main character fit into this time period? When you're done, you're going to continue reading your historical fiction book or start a new one if you're done. If you want to step up the rigor and try something different, you can draw your own timeline that shows the timeline of your book matching up with the time period the setting takes place in. So I'm just going to show you what your stop and jot should look and sound like. This exemplar will be posted for you, but you're going to be answering these 3 questions. How is this text helping me to understand the time period? How does the character's timeline intersect with the timeline of world events? And how does my main character fit into this time period? So here's the exemplar. After reading an informational book about World War II, I realized that Rose Blanche was a young German girl growing up during World War II. At the beginning, she supported the Nazis. Let's change that. I know this because in the beginning of the text, I see her in an image holding a Nazi flag. During this time period, now I'm answering question 2. During this time period, Jewish people were placed in concentration camps and some were even killed. In the text, it says that Rose Blanche saw these children and she decided to help them. And now I give the evidence. Since I had a piece of bread, I carefully handed it to them through the pointed wires. I can even add my thinking, like this makes me think. I'm going to add interpretation. That she was very brave. Because if someone would have seen her, she could have been killed right there and then. Okay. Now I'm answering question 3. How does my main character fit into this time period? Rose Blanche decided to be a rebel to help others. She was brave in her actions and even sacrificed her life to help. This makes me think that she became a victim of war, although she was just trying to do the right thing. So now you guys have an exemplar and you see how I wrote long for this stop and jot? We expect you to be doing the same thing. Good luck, guys!